The Dan Yorke State of Mind program is brought to you in part by Lookout Rhode Island and Takeo Comfort Solutions.
Good evening and welcome to my State of Mind. I am Dan Yorke, and you're watching this program in its original playing on Wednesday evening. Tonight's broadcast is a continuation of the conversation about the passing of George Floyd and the ramifications, specifically the protest movements, and even more specifically, a letter that was written by faculty at Brown and in other places, signed now by hundreds of educators across the region, originally sent to Governor Raimondo, asking for them to back off and provide what they called soft policing at protest events. The philosophy about soft policing and why they think it's warranted, the conversations about inequities in the criminal justice system, and really a lot of the momentum from this tragic occurrence that has grabbed the nation's attention. All part of the conversation with Francoise Hamlin, professor of history and Africana studies at Brown University. We will pause and we'll begin the conversation when we return. Please stay with us. Back into my State of Mind here. You're watching the Wednesday program, which we recorded yesterday midday, still kind of on a one-day lag. And I mentioned that to you to make sure that in case anything major happens in the news cycle, that you are well aware that we're playing catch up. Francoise Hamlin is my guest. She's been a friend of the show for the last couple of years. She is a professor of history and Africana studies at Brown University. And yes, she is from England. So in case you're wondering, the problem is not in your Zoom, and it's not a problem. It's great to have you back. Welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be back.
So you, along with a bunch of faculty, sent a letter to the governor and other state leaders about your concerns about the way things are going with, the police monitoring of protests and the like. And of course, we've been through a pretty hectic couple of weeks where all across the country it was violent, and I think there are infiltrators and perpetrators that are doing what they can to upset this apple cart, who may be from whatever side of the anarchical aisle that exists. And that needs a whole lot more, I think, national and local investigation. We'll get to that in the next segment. Before we get into protesting and the like, just tell me what your head and your heart are telling you right now about what's happened the last couple of weeks with the George Floyd tragedy and all.
I'm heartbroken. And I've said this to you before. I have a 12-year-old son, and so I worry for him. Am I surprised? No. We've done, we've danced this dance many times, and we're doing it again. And history has shown that, sort of white supremacist maintained violence against people of color, particularly, public servants, killing folks and not getting punished for it, is a problem. And I think this time, perhaps because of the quarantine and all of these, the quarantine particularly, and the disease, COVID, affecting people of color, I think it's just more obvious to folks who haven't necessarily thought about it before, how systemic racism and inequalities have really sort of damaged this country in the long run.
It's interesting that you say that, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit because, I struggled. I'm now writing a column for the Valley Breeze on a weekly basis. And I touched this base, and I had to edit a couple of times trying to get it right. Because when I read back what I had written, I said, COVID-19, changed this whole dynamic. And I didn't want to give the impression that what happened to George Floyd would not have been horrifying to the country in its own innate evil, or put a word on it. But what I am trying to say is that, to your point, minority communities in this country are adversely affected because of congregate settings, because of socioeconomic issues, the way the virus travels, all that kind of a thing. The outreach is not as strong as it needs to be. I'm not sure the political leadership has been as diligent on this stuff as it needs to be. And I just think the idea that all of us, black, white, purple, or orange, have been pent up for 3 months. We're feeling better now, but that tension, I think, accelerated not only the reaction to this incident, but the country's attention to it. Do you agree?
Um, Perhaps it's hard to. I'm right. I mean, we're kind of guessing the cause and effect. I mean, he was um, the last of a list of deaths by the hands of police or white supremacists or both in the past week, right? Starting from the jogger in Atlanta, Breonna Taylor. I mean, so there's a whole sort of clutch of folks whose deaths have been caught on camera. And sort of that sort of momentum has been building for a while. I think the space of Minneapolis is important too to think about, and sort of where things sort of start erupting. But yes, I do think that these discussions about systemic racism and inequality have been floating more than usual because of Corona, and people have been reading more and educating themselves more because they've been at home, right? They've had the time to do that. And sort of thinking about who this is affecting and why, and the protests, and seeing the disparity between police action when the protesters against quarantine have been white, showing up at the State House fully armed, in police spaces, nothing happens to them. And yet, a peaceful demonstration, and what happens? I think those inequalities have been are now sort of irrefutable. And sort of the idea of, getting a haircut and protesting a haircut is okay, but protesting a murder isn't. And sort of that disparity, and sort of the juxtaposition of the imaging and how the police have reacted in both instances, I think folks who didn't want to see it before can't say they didn't see it. And can't say that that's not true, that it hasn't been true. For all those people who've been protesting quarantine, they're mostly white folks who want haircuts. Because once it became clear that the disease was really affecting minority populations disproportionately, I think people felt safe. They're like, oh, well, this doesn't affect me, so why am I on quarantine for that, and that's just the nature of this country, unfortunately. All of that is in the air. And I think that maybe have accelerated things.
Interesting. I mean, I want to, you know what, I'm going to hold on to that thought. Francoise Hamlin, professor at Brown, is with us. We'll pause here. We'll come back because I want to develop the protesting haircut thing. I think.
I'm just reading the signs, the banners, right? So.
There's no doubt that that is provocative. We shall be right back on Dan Yorke's State of Mind Statements. Back to my state of mind here. Francoise Hamlin is my guest. She is a professor of Africana Studies at Brown University, history too, of course. And she's been able to really bring us a lot of historical perspective over the course of the last couple of years with some of her guest appearances here on the show. Look, you said something really provocative there, and that is that when it turned out that maybe it's not, the virus is not as dangerous. By the way, I don't think we ought to be getting cocky about the virus at all. Even
absolutely,
all sorts of things that we still need to be careful about. But here's the thing. The visual that you painted of white protesters armed, I will tell you, unnerved the daylights out of me. I just seeing that. You ask the question both on your broadcast forums and just in your life. How do you get away with that? How do you show up at a state capitol armed and not literally be taken away for that? Who's licensed to carry those weapons? At the same time,
that considered a non-violent protest, but people who actually aren't carrying any weapons and are really protesting, and including their families. Yeah,
understood. But only to play devil's advocate to an argument that both of you and I agree about, because I think it's unnerving, unwarranted, and there needs to be a remedy for it. For the most part, there's no violence. The threat. I mean, the physicality and the presence of weapons is violent in and of itself, but there is no shootings, blah, 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 blah. At the same time, unarmed protesters are, hurling objects, breaking windows, physicality, confrontations with police, and we get that kind of thing going back and forth. So it's really, it's hard to figure out which which behavior is the most detrimental and worthy of?
Well, I think we have, well, with the protesters, they're protesting murder, right? And if you are elevating property over murder, then there's a whole moral conversation that needs to be had. And I think, and again, this is part of American history where, property rules and people were property, right? And so the idea of, folks getting very mad about protest, the violence, without understanding root cause of what people might do when they've never had a voice, when they've never been heard, when they're frustrated, when the police continue, even when and there have been videos of police aggravating protesters and attacking protesters. I've seen photographs of police 6 inches from a child's face spraying whatever it is they're spraying into their eyes. Why? Because, and the whole sort of rhetoric of a bad apple, but if you leave the bad apple in a barrel, the whole barrel's rotten. So at some point you have to deal with that. And so the idea of, yes, the violence, of course, I do not justify the violence at all. I'm an anti-violence person. However, the violence done that kills is way more, there's no comparison. And I sort of worry about us focusing on broken glass and loss of property that's insured to the loss of life, which is the root of it. And folks don't want to deal with the root, don't want to deal with the systemic racism and the systemic problem of police brutality. I want to focus and distract themselves on, well, two wrongs don't make a right. Absolutely. But the public servants need to protect and serve everyone and not kill them. And I think that's the disparity between them, right? And also, yes, I mean, we discussed it before. A lot of the people who were doing the looting were either white supremacists who were brought on scene to cause a ruckus at the, and to make sure that to tarnish the image of the protesters. And that's historical fact. It's been happening for, decades. Or it's white kids who think they're allies, but see an opportunity to do something fun, right? So they're, and there's been videos circulating about that too, of protesters saying, don't put our name on this thing. This is not us. Why are you doing this? We didn't ask you to do this. If you want to protest us, this is not the way.
I wouldn't want to let that go uncontested. I mean, there's enough video out there of young Black youth also, throwing, things into windows and ripping off stuff.
Sure, but I think we need to be very clear that to not necessarily link the protests to the violence and what's been going on, because most of the protesters, the majority of the protesters, when unprovoked by the police, when there's soft policing at these events, there's no problem.
And I think it's fair to say and important to say that the early turbulence has weaned itself into what I think has been a pretty comfortable discomfort. I mean, that the protests themselves have become, peaceful by nature. It's almost like the gas has been let out of the anarchical infiltration almost. And it seems like now, we have 10,000 people in Providence on Friday of last week. And,
yeah, I was there.
Yeah, and for the most part, it goes fine in the sense that there's no real violence. At the end, the governor comes in and does her cameo because reportedly people won't leave the last 1,000 won't leave the State House steps, and of course, we end up talking about the fact that she's maskless while she is the czar of coronavirus, and she stepped in it there, spilt milk, I guess, at this point. But the overriding image, I think, has got to be that at least in the last handful of days, locally and nationally, there's been very little violence. Now,
right, I think, there's been very little violence, and I think in part it's because of letters and pressure on state officials to make sure that doesn't happen. So one thing that we were able to do as educators is to corral other educators in the state. So this letter that we wrote, that we sent to the governor, was written less than 24 hours before the event. And by the time of the event, we had over 500 signatures. We're currently near 900 signatures. That's how quickly it moved. So the governor had those names of educators across the state at the university level, down to the grade school level, down to preschool, because it was their children who were out there on the front lines. And at the marches themselves, there were a lot of teachers there saying, these are my kids, don't hurt them. And so I think because of the pressure that we had soft policing at that event. Right. I mean, yes, they were totally there, sort of guarding the mall, and the show of arms. There were tanks there. There were people. They were there with their arms on the rifles. Whatever. And that's disconcerting because it wasn't necessary. They could have had regular officers on point. But there was also soft policing, right? They didn't interfere with anyone. So I think it was the overreaction of the police trying to protect themselves and trying to protect their way of life, and sort of whatever, and that kind of over militarizing of the police that really ignited the anger. So I think we have to, again, it's like going to the root cause. The root cause is over policing, and sort of police literally getting away with murder. Right? And when there's a protest of the police, they come out again and start abusing the communities. And that just makes people angrier. And that doesn't mean violence is the answer, but there has to be some outlet. Sorry.
When we come back, we'll wrap up about some of the concepts that have been discussed this week, including this notion of defunding the police. Francoise Hamlin from Brown University is with us. We'll be right back on the University. Welcome back to My State of Mind. Francoise Hamlin, Brown University professor, Africana Studies, history, one of the authors of a letter to the governor to kind of ease off and create this soft policing response to protesting. Francoise, tell me about let's see if we can have a quickie conversation on this concept of defunding police. I find it to be a word that has got a lot of attention, caused a big stir. Yeah. Any time that you reprioritize a budget, you defund some money here and you add fund, I don't know what the word is, you add funds to some money here. I see it as that. You see it as any deeper than that?
It is, well, I think you're right. The word has been very divisive, and I don't think it's like abolish the police, right? I don't think that's the answer. I think it's about demilitarizing the police. And sort of pushing those funds, pushing the funds that have, if you look at the budgets, the policing budget's insane and the education budget is not. And I think if you think about how you can redirect real funds to help address the systemic inequality, that would be the way to do it. Because then the police don't think that they can get away with murder, right? Because they have a lot of money to insulate themselves and pay people in civil lawsuits to shut people up at the end of it, right? Because everyone has to sign a DNA. Is that the right word? DNA. Do not disclose. So it's so I think that's what that means. It's kind of, it's not a complete all or nothing.
NDA, not disclosure agreement, but I know exactly. Yeah. Here's the thing, you're going to be invited back as much as you'd like to be, and I want to talk about this defunding and all the concepts that have been given birth by this terrible tragedy. But I cannot leave the show without addressing some of your tone. And your tone, you're referencing to police murdering, and you've got to. Every time you make a reference to it in a very succinct and creative way that you do, you're jolting this audience. You're jolting it. It's like rock'em sock'em robots. You're banging their chin back.
But I'm not lying.
But do you have some mitigating affinity for law enforcement that you want to articulate? Because it feels very angry. Very, I don't even know what the word is. Narrow.
It's not narrow. I'm raising a 12-year-old boy, and I have to raise him to be frightened of the police. That they're not there to save him. That if they slow down, it's not to help him, but it might be to kill him. Tamir Rice was 12 years old playing in a park when he was gunned down by a policeman. who didn't get, who still walks free. So I'm angry and I'm scared. This is real for me, right? So yes, it might sock people in the head because it's not their reality, and so they don't have to think about it. But I do.
When you see a police officer, black or white, Hispanic, whatever,
cold fear.
All the time.
All the time.
Never wanes.
Nope. Why should it? I mean, why should it? And that's a problem, right? It's a problem. Yeah. And it's right. And that's what I think, and yes, I have a British accent. And once people hear that, I see the vision, I see how people react differently. But I've been stopped by the police and for no reason. And then the minute sort of the accent comes out, it's like, oh, okay, we'll let you go, right? And then my husband gets stopped for no reason. And I'm in the car with him, and it's so yes, it's Black parents have to teach their children a different narrative about the police than other people have to teach their children, and that's a problem.
And I'm going to actually leave it there because I think I just want that to I want that to resonate. I want we'll leave how that gets better to another day soon.
Okay.
Thank you very much for.
Thank you.
Pretty fascinating. Brown University professor at Africana and History Studies, Francoise Hamlin. Clearly, she left us with something that I'll just let marinate for a while, and we'll pick it up from there. Certainly a conversation on WPRO, weekdays 3 till 6. We'll be back here tomorrow night on My State of Mind. Thank you so much for tuning in. Good night.